Welcome back to another edition of Eye on the Issues. Of course, I'm Mike Garofalo. Today we're talking about educational choice with Chris Cargill. He is president of Mountain States Policy Center. Chris, welcome to the show, and let's begin by giving people a little bit of your background.
Sure, Mike. Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. I was born and raised in the North Idaho, Eastern Washington area. Went to Gonzaga University, worked in TV news for 10 years, and then joined Washington Policy Center, which, as you know, is the free market think tank in Washington State, and then decided I was going to make my way over to Idaho and some of the mountain states as well. So we created Mountain States Policy Center in 2002, and we're based in Idaho, but we cover policy issues as well, from Montana and hopefully Wyoming as well, and Eastern Washington and Oregon, and want to make sure that we're providing research and recommendations, as you guys do as well, on issues related to education and transportation and healthcare and small business and budget and tax. So
Sure.
We've had great success in Idaho so far, and looking forward to adding another voice to the fray in other states as well.
Nice. Oh, well, let's begin by talking about education choice. And you wrote there a column. There are 180 studies on the impact of education choice. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's remarkable because sometimes, as you know, Mike, you get into these conversations or debates with people about education choice. They don't exactly know what it means. Some people understand it, some don't. What I like to do is try to define what it means first, and then kind of tell them what the research tells us. So education choice, as you know, Mike, is basically all of the above. It's public schools, it's private schools, it's magnet schools, charter schools, homeschools. It's basically providing families and parents and students with the opportunity to get their child into a school that works best for them. And as you know, every child is different. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And so while the current K through 12 system might have been great 100 years ago and might have catered to everyone 100 years ago, things have changed. And it is really important for us as a society, as a state, as a region, to make sure that we're offering parents as many different options as possible. So I've really been pleased to see a number of bills, as you know, Mike, introduced in Wyoming. There are a few in Idaho as well. There are some in Montana. In fact, Montana just passed an ESA for special needs kids in the last year. That really is the goal, is to try to provide as many different options as possible. My son is autistic. He doesn't fit into the public school box necessarily. He needs different assistance. And we need to make sure as a society we're offering kids like my son and others the opportunity to succeed. Now, as far as your question about the studies, what's also been remarkable to me is the number of people who don't really realize how much this has been researched and looked into. And of course, some of our friends in the national movement as well have given us access to all these different studies, 187 of them, empirical studies, which show us that education choice not only helps kids who are taking advantage of an education choice opportunity, but also the kids who remain behind in the public school. Maybe the public school works really, really well for them. Maybe their kids or the parents really like Mr. Smith or Mrs. Johnson, and they know the public school well, and they don't want anything to change. And that's great. Public schools are part of education choice. But the studies and the research show us that for the kids who don't necessarily fit into that box, they need more opportunity. They need different items. And the research tells us that this can be really, really successful if it's done properly.
And why do you suspect such the pushback in some states from some lawmakers? Is it all about following the money? And oh boy, if a private school got some of this education money, the public school is not going to get it, and that's going to be a problem. Is that what this is all about? I mean, you would think the no-brainer is let's give families as many choices as possible.
Yeah, I wish I could say it's one thing or another, Mike, but it seems like every conversation that I'm in, it's a different excuse. Today, the conversation that I had earlier today, I was a guest at a luncheon where we were talking about this issue and a bill specifically that's being introduced in Idaho that is essentially just a tax credit. I mean, it takes $0 out of the public school budget. It's completely separate from the public school budget. It's not even going through the education committees in Idaho. And yet there is this notion by folks who oppose it that it's going to somehow defund public schools, which is remarkable to me considering that it's a completely separate line item and doesn't really have anything to do with the public schools. But I think I think there are a lot of unwarranted concerns, Mike, and I think, quite frankly, it all boils down to a lot of folks don't like to have competition. A lot of folks do not like to have to compete for students. They've liked the system set up the way that it is, where it's just been, 100 years of just funding the local public school and cheering for that public school on a Friday night football game and all those other things. There's a lot of pride, obviously, in communities about local public schools. And so if there's any notion that this could defund a public school or that students might leave a public school for something else, then people oppose it tooth and nail.
Yeah, it would seem to be a no-brainer. But so what is the status? First of all, that measure in Idaho, I hope maybe you were able to help educate some people as to how it's going to be no money coming out of the educational budget. But what is the status of school choice in Idaho?
So in Idaho, it's a tough issue, just like it is in Wyoming, because as you know, Michael, we have super majorities in both chambers. The conservative side of this ledger has super majorities in both chambers, just like in Cheyenne, and we're facing a situation where instead of concentrating on the issue, sometimes they fight against each other. And that makes it really difficult to get something done on this issue. I mean, we've got this tax credit that they're talking about right now. We had an ESA bill last year at this time. There's been a bill to expand what's called the Empowering Parents Program in Idaho, which is essentially like a mini ESA. There have never been voucher bills. Despite what the opponents try to paint these as, vouchers are completely separate than ESAs or tax credits. But voucher sometimes is a dirty word that sometimes gives a negative connotation. So they really like to try to say everything is a voucher, which we know that it's not. So the current status is of the tax credit bill in Idaho. It's a $50 million tax credit. It's capped. So the most amount of students you're looking at is maybe 7,000 to 8,000 at the most. And we have a state of 310,000 people who are 310,000 kids who are in the public school system. So we're not talking about that large of a program.
And how about vouchers? Is that measure, has a measure been proposed and passed, or where does that
No.
stand in Idaho?
Yeah, there's really never been a good, I mean, not recently, been a movement to try to put vouchers in place, which is even more frustrating because the folks who are against education choice label everything else that isn't a voucher for the sake of trying to scare people, which we know for sure that none of these systems that they're introducing are vouchers. But no, there's really never been a recent voucher idea or bill that's been put forward.
And so if you were to talk to some lawmakers in the state of Wyoming right now, and let's say they're listening to this, which I'm sure many will, what do you say to them about school choice? What's your pitch?
Well, a couple of different things. One, obviously, both you and I live in very rural states, and I think there's a concern on behalf of especially rural legislators that, oh, this is just going to create a disaster for my local school district, and that the research just does not show that. For instance, in Florida, and obviously Florida is much more urban than our states are, but there are rural parts of Florida. And before they put education choice in, they only had about 60 options for a private school or a magnet type schools in those rural parts of Florida. After they adopted their program in Florida, they have now more than 130 options. So what ends up happening is that, yeah, if there's no marketplace for something like this, you're right, it's not going to open up in a rural area. But if you allow the marketplace to flourish, you're going to see new schools open up. You're going to see different types of schools open up. I was really pleased actually and tickled to see a tweet that actually came out. I believe it was in Arizona or may have been Iowa. I can't remember which state it was, but the point was this father had been talking about this issue for quite some time. He had been talking about about this with his neighbors, and since they are allowing now an education choice plan in his state, he's going to work together with his neighbors to create a micro school. That's exactly that's the type of thing that happens in states that allow for more innovation and more choice options. And I think the other thing I would say, Michael, is that this does not shut down public schools. This does not really even impact public schools. What we have seen in state after state after state is that the states that offer more education choice actually see an increase in results from their public schools as opposed to a decrease or a public school closure as a result of it. So those are the 2 points I think that are really important to make.
Yeah, well, I think that's super important what you just said, and I hope lawmakers out there are listening to that point specifically. Now, there's another measure called Public School Transparency Act in Idaho. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so as you know, Mike, and as folks who may know who have watched or are watching the program today, who have tried to read and understand their local school district budget, I mean, it's like trying to read a foreign language. It is really, really difficult. I mean, there are sometimes hundreds of pages, dozens of different funds, money going here, money going there. If you're just an average citizen, if you're a mom or a dad and you're taking your kid to practice, you don't have the time or sometimes the capability necessarily to understand what all these funds are doing and what's going where and who's spending what. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to encourage lawmakers, no matter what state they live in, to pass what's called the Public School Transparency Act. And it's very simple. What it does is it requires every school district on the very first page of their budget to put 5 or 6 key data points. One, how much total funds and allocation resources that they have. 2, how much is actually getting to the classroom. And that average, as you know, Mike, is somewhere between usually 60 to 70% that actually gets to the classroom. How much they're paying their average administrators in salary and benefits, how much they're paying average teachers in salary and benefits, the administrator to teacher to student ratio, and then the test scores and or results from the latest assessment that lawmakers can choose. The whole reason to do this is to try to make it so that parents understand and the community understands. They're able to look and say, okay, school district A, school district B, I can see that they're spending more money here, they're spending more money there. What am I to draw from that? That's up to you as a parent, obviously, but that's information that would be readily available. And then you can compare and contrast your school districts.
So what's the status of this measure? Has it been presented yet?
My understanding is that it's going to be introduced next week in our legislative session here in Boise. And I know our superintendent of public instruction is behind it. I know there are many legislators who are behind it as well, because look, the school districts already have this information. It's just hidden in the budget somewhere. So really what we're asking them to do is to just have a uniform page that's the very front page of the budget to make it easier for parents to understand.
Got it. All right, I'm going to throw you a fastball right down the middle right now. Why is it so important for children to have a good education?
Well, that is a fastball, and there's so many different directions we could go with that. And I only hit from the right side, so I would probably pull it into left field. So let me go into the left field part here. I think it's important, obviously, because they're the future of the country. When I look at my kids, look, I have 2 boys at home, and one is special needs and one's not. Obviously, they're both very different, but I sometimes worry, and I hope other parents do as well, about what kind of future they're going to inherit. They're the ones who are going to be running for office. They're the ones who are going to be running our companies. They're the ones who are going to be running our schools. And if they don't have a good education, obviously, that is going to make it much more difficult for us to maintain our superpower status as a country, and to continue to lead the world. And so I would just tell you, we ought to be, the number one thing we ought to be concerned about is not where a child gets his or her education, it's the quality of the education.
Agreed completely. So people want to find out more about you and your organization and what you do and what you post out there. Where do people go?
mountainstatespolicy.org is our website. And there's a bunch of research and recommendations and data points there. And mountainstatespolicy.org. You can get on our website and sign up to get on our mailing list if you'd like as well.
All right, Chris, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. And people that want to learn more about this from Wyoming, go to yliberty.org, sign up for our newsletter. So Chris, thanks again. We really appreciate it. I'm sure I'm going to be talking to you again.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike.